nanites end up traveling through his body and into his brain. And it's the craziest thing, because when he's basically saying, when he's talking to the scientist, and he's like, capturing me doesn't mean anything, her response is, we're not capturing anybody. You guys killed my husband, you're gonna die. And Cyclops gets shot in the face and dies. All the X-Men sent on this mission died. Every single one of them died. It's the craziest thing ever, because now what we get, and this is going to be a sight to behold. Now what we get is the wrath of Charles Xavier and the wrath of Magneto, and I am hyped to see what that looks like. Okay, so you guys are going to bear with me for a second. It might be a little bit echoey in here, and I'll try my best to reduce it, but I'm actually working on my sound recording space at the moment, so we got to make do. But we are covering Powers of X. Those of you guys who are following me on Twitter, you guys know that I was taking a break for this week, but I'm doing Powers of X because I love House of Powers of X. Now, where House of X covers the 10th life of Moira McTaggart, basically, Powers of X covers a 10-year window, covers 3 different time periods, right? So the point at which the X-Men were being formed, or at least when Xavier was trying to bring the team together, before it really officially formed. And then the second era is basically the modern day, and the third era is in the future. Now, one thing we've never actually done here is we haven't actually established a chronological time period of when this takes place, right? I mean, for the sake of the story, Hickman's just using a general period of time, like between this point and this point is basically when everything takes place. That way he's not really forced to narrow things down and force it into a chronological period, because then it would all kind of go to pieces and they run out. Marvel also kind of makes an editorial mandate, as far as I'm aware. You can't really ascribe dates to comics, otherwise it actually puts a solidified date on them. Whereas you can sort of just say it takes place somewhere, maybe around the modern day, who knows. They just kind of call it a day, which is what they really do now. Charles Xavier served in the Korean War, which lasted loosely between 1950 and 1953. I mean, it's, give or take, a few months here and there in terms of the beginning and the end, but we can usually say at some point in 1953 is basically when it came to an end. And then from there, we basically have what's around maybe an 11-year window, not really an 11-year window, probably a 8 or 9 year window between the time the Korean War ended and the time Xavier started the X-Men. Now, before Hickman started writing the comics as they exist now, the explanation that Marvel gave us in terms of why Xavier started the X-Men in the first place was because of the fact that he met a Malcolm, he met the Shadow King, and it was first introduction into a mutant that was literally just malevolent, right? It was just an evil entity that existed out there and didn't want to do anything but inflict harm on people. And realizing that was, that it would make no sense to simply assume it was the only one, and drawing the logical conclusion that there's other mutants out there that would try to pursue the same goal, right? World domination, or just inflicting harm, or whatever. Xavier launched the X-Men. And so what we're looking at here is sometime during this 8-year window, between 1953-54, running all the way up to around 1961-62, so we'll probably say around 9 years, when the X-Men were basically introduced to Marvel Comics, right? Or at least when the team was officially formed, right? Because when the comic first picked up, the team had already been formed. So we can kind of say somewhere along those lines, this 8-year window is when all this takes place. But what this does, where it says X-Men 0, X-Men Year 1, this basically picks up with them going to visit Bar Sinister. Now again, this is Hickman referencing his own work. Bar Sinister was given to us as part of Secret Wars, right? When you had like Battle World, and you had the realm where Sinister hung out, his base of operation more or less, it was called Bar Sinister. So it's kind of cool to see, because what you also get here are all these different versions of Sinister himself. Now, this is something Jonathan Hickman does not explain. Those of you guys who read Secret Wars and who read Avengers New Avengers can harken back to this, but the only real conclusion we can draw from this is that either these are clones that Sinister made of himself, or they're the alternate reality counterparts who have just been here ever since. Now, you have these different versions of himself, and then you have the actual Nathaniel Essex, who seems to be the one sitting here. This is kind of a big moment here. This is kind of a big thing, because what Hickman does is change up pretty much everything we know about Nathaniel Essex, and he says that he has a mutant gene. This is wholly new territory. This is Jonathan Hickman shifting things up entirely. But for Sinister himself, a little bit of backstory here, and you guys will find a link in the description for Mr. Sinister Explained, which again is part of our X-Men playlist, or X-Men Encyclopedia. To basically sum this up, Sinister used to be called a guy named Nathaniel Essex, and the idea was that he was obsessed with genealogy, right? He was obsessed with the idea that somewhere along the line that humans were going to give way to people with abilities, right? So it was basically the concept of mutants, but not really knowing what it was. It was simply just a theory that he had. But because of the fact that the villain Apocalypse didn't really even know what he was, and then overheard the theories of Sinister, and then was basically told, you're a mutant, right? You're the next stage in human evolution. In response, the question was asked, do you want to be able to do this kind of stuff forever? And when the answer was yes, then you ended up having Apocalypse, who uses technology to transform Nathaniel Essex into Mr. Sinister, right? So up until this point, this particular comic right now, the form and function of Sinister's powers is that they were bestowed on him by external means, by, Apocalypse using celestial technology to modify the genes of Nathaniel Essex. What Hickman is doing here is saying, No. That basically, either he's going to reconcile the two and say that what Apocalypse did was wake up the mutant gene of Nathaniel Essex, or he's going to come back and he's going to say that never happened. But then basically meeting with Sinister is interesting here, because Xavier shows up and he basically says, we know that what you're doing right now is going through and cataloging the world's DNA, right? That's what Sinister does. He looks at the entire world's population and says, who's a particular interest here? Basically, it's Professor X and Magneto simply saying, we know that you catalog mutant genes, and even just human genes to a degree. We know that you're a collector. These are things that are of interest to you. So what we want to do here is we want to work with you. We basically want to bring you the entire catalog of the mutant genealogy as we discover it. We'll be the one who will catalog it, we'll alter it, we'll exactly do whatever we want with it. Just don't destroy the genes, and don't do anything like various, like clone people or anything, which is what he did with Jean Grey. He made Madeline Pryor. But the fact remains, that like basically you're going to be the database management for the entirety of the X-Men population, or at least the mutant population. And where this version of Sinister basically shuts it down and says, why would I want to work with any of you, on this particular thing? He's basically killed from behind, and we're met with the real Nathaniel Essex. Now, this is kind of like a big change in terms of Nathaniel Essex as we know him, because he's kind of depicted more as like well, there's really no better way to say it. He's sassy. That's basically what he is. Like, it's me, Mr. Sinister. I'm fabulous. It's kind of what it seems like, and I think it's kind of cool, actually. I think it's kind of interesting. But it's a pretty cool thing, because what this does is this sets the stage that where we previously looked at all the X-Men stories that came before Powers and House of X, and we saw Mr. Sinister as a guy who was collecting the DNA of mutants by using subterfuge, right? Like doing it in a very, very sneaky way, in a very underhanded way, basically doing what he was not supposed to do. What we're finding out here is that Xavier basically sent him on that path, and that this has all been happening at the hands of Xavier, which is, again, a pretty cool concept. And so what this does is this switches over to Doug Ramsey, and it switches over to Xavier, and basically Xavier kind of, again, setting in motion all the things that are going on right now with the establishment of Krakoa as being a mutant haven. Now, up until this point, and this is kind of an interesting thing here, because when this happens, and we basically get, a few months ago, when we speed up to what's basically a few months before the events of the modern day picked up with regards to House and Powers of X, we end up finding that Xavier traveled back to Krakoa. Now, Krakoa had always kind of been an enemy island, more or less, of the X-Men, insofar that it was a giant-sized X-Men story, right? Like this story where they all kind of came together and they had to save the X-Men from Krakoa and all that kind of good stuff. One of the cool things that Hickman does about this is he actually says it's not really what we think it is, right? In the sense that Krakoa is there, but it's not really a malevolent island. It's not an evil place. It's an island that's there, and it never really had any true contact, or at least in its present form, never really seemed to have any true contact with beings that were out there, and was really more curious than anything else. And so what he basically does is he brings Cypher along for the purpose of being able to understand Krakoa. And the reason why this matters is because where Xavier can tap into Krakoa, and Xavier can understand the more empathetic humans, right, in the sense of what Krakoa is feeling and how it's perceiving things, Doug Ramsey, again, as a mutant that can basically speak any language, can essentially understand the language of Krakoa as it talks, and then turn it, create an alphabet, more or less, and then pass that on in the form of Xavier absorbing it, and then setting it up so every mutant can understand it. That's really kind of how all that works. But basically the way this played out is, in the modern day, the various X-Men who want to escape human persecution, more or less, who want to go to a safe place, will go to Krakoa. But the question was always asked, if Krakoa speaks a language that nobody on Earth understands, then how do they understand it? This is where that begins. That is Douglas Ramsey sitting down, is Douglas Ramsey learning to understand the language, having a full-on conversation, spending about a year to really grasp how it is that Krakoa talks. It's like learning French or Spanish or something like that. And then in turn, what Xavier does is he takes that information and he copies it out of the mind of Doug Ramsey, and then from there, the various telepaths stationed around Krakoa install that language, for lack of a better word, into the mind of new mutants, so they understand exactly what it is that Krakoa is saying and how the island functions. It's a pretty cool thing. Now from there, it jumps into the origin of Krakoa itself, in terms of what Krakoa was before it became the landmass that it is now. But what we're told here is that at some point in the past, there was simply just a land called Okara. And the way it's described here by Hickman is a little interesting, but also a little strange at the same time, right? Because this land is described as being ancient before the word existed, but not old in the way that, that they were old. That, like, the world itself is old, meaning that this island existed, but, like, either it was artificially created or it rose up somewhere along the line. I would say this chunk of landmass probably rose up sometime during the Great Cataclysm, right? When the Celestial showed up during the Second Host, they wiped out most of the deviants, they sunk Atlantis, but somehow this popped up in the process, right? It's the only little way to make it make sense. And the reason why I say that is because somewhere along the line, this landmass of Wakara was split in half, and it became Arakno and Krakoa. And from this giant rift, more or less, between these two chunks of land, came these massive demons, right? This Twilight Sword basically came with them. Now, the Twilight Sword is interesting, because on one hand, it kind of looks like the all-black Necro Sword, but it's not. So we know this is not Null the God, Null the symbiote god, right? And then my thought was, well, if it's being called the Twilight Sword, then maybe it's the Twilight Sword of Surtur. The issue is that the Twilight Sword of Surtur looks a little bit different. The reality here is we're not given an explicit explanation of what these guys are. All we're told is that these demons, these monsters more or less, showed up out of this rift, and then ultimately they were fought by the Apocalypse. And this is why I say this takes place probably somewhere around 4,000 to 4,500 years ago, right? Because Apocalypse was born 5,000 years before the modern day, and he didn't rise to prominence until around maybe 100 years after everything that took place in Egypt, right? So maybe around 4,900 years ago is when this may or may not take place, right? So we've got an almost 5,000-year window between when this happened, right? So if we scale it down and go by what we're being told, maybe anywhere between 5 to 4,000 years before the modern day. But regardless, it took place a long time ago. And we don't really know what these beings are. And in fact, all we're really told here is that by virtue of Apocalypse defeating these forces and then casting them back down into the cavern and then cutting off that entire section of Krakoa from itself, that Krakoa's kind of been half an island ever since, and it always will be forever, right? It doesn't really seem to be super important at the moment, but that's the nature of Jonathan Hickman writing. He gives you something that seems pretty innocuous, right? It's just a thing that's there, and then suddenly it becomes super important in like 20 issues, right? So that's one of these reasons why when you're going out and buying and you're reading these stories, you have to pay attention to everything. Ultimately, what ends up happening here is Douglas Ramsey stays on Krakoa for about a year, and then basically goes through the process of understanding how it all works. And so what we do at this point is we jump to the future, and we talk about this concept of basically ascension. Now remember, from what we saw in the last issue, ascension is basically like this sort of final step for those individuals who are essentially robots, right? Like the idea is that when a robot's created, with a baseline signal is really where Hickman starts from. You go from a baseline signal, which is given a command, and the command is basically eliminate mutants. Now, it follows that command to the best of its ability, and it's given a little bit of leeway there, right? Insofar as that a signal would look at a mutant and say, okay, mutants are the enemy, but mutants stem from humans because of the next step in human evolution. Therefore, all mutants have the potential to become mutants, and so all humans are enemies. Like, that's the kind of conclusion that a signal would draw, right? But only insofar as the command that it's given, right? It wouldn't say, like, your job is to take care of, like, all mutants. Like, a signal wouldn't look at that and then extrapolate and say, okay, because there's humans, then there's humanoids, we should also take out humanoids. No, it's confined to that line of programming. Beyond that, you go into master mode, which is given a little bit more of leeway in terms of signals, in terms of how it creates them, as well as, like, getting up and leaving and going to a safe place if it's in danger, but it's still continually following the program of my job is to create signals. Then you go into a mother mode, which is a little more intelligent. Then you go into a Nimrod, which is artificial intelligence. And then you go into what are basically humans that are bonded with nanites and become like the perfect sort of signal. But the issue with this, and this is one of the things that Hickman kind of points out here, is that this ascendancy that's currently taking place right now, this landscape in 1,000 years in the future, what we found out in the last video, is that these aren't humans, and they're not mutants. That humans and mutants have essentially been wiped out or pushed to the brink of extinction. Mutants, for the most part, seem to be gone almost entirely. What's left of them exists way out there in the far reaches of space as part of the Shi'ar Empire. Those who are left on Earth, and there's probably around 8 or 9 of them, they're the only ones really left in this part of the universe. From there, you basically look at humans, and what we were told here is that humans kind of exist in small little encampments, but they're more fleeing for their lives and trying not to be caught. That what you have now, basically running the show, are these human and robot hybrids, right? These sort of perfect beings, these omega symbols, more or less, is what they're called, that exist out there. The issue they're running into here is that when the phalanx show up and they're trying to reach ascendancy, the goal of the phalanx is to basically look around at all machine concepts. They're like all robots who have achieved a higher level of artificial intelligence that basically allows them to transcend their programming and even transcend humanity, right? To think far beyond the means of a normal human, but to also somewhat function as humans and then absorb them into themselves if they're far enough along, if they're of interest, right? That's basically what it is. The issue with this is that they're not fully robotic. And so one of the ways they're trying to get around that, and this is kind of where this comic ends, one of the ways they're trying to get around that is they're actually trying to essentially take their consciousness and then put it inside a computer shell. And then when that's done, the phalanx will see that computer shell and then say, okay, like we will absorb that because as far as the phalanx are aware, this is a being that's achieved, or I guess a machine that's achieved a higher level of thinking. That really seems to be what's going on here. But again, this is classic Hickman, right? You get this little bit of information and then it's done. And that's basically it, and then it wraps up. And it's a cool little moment here because the question is, are beings actually going to achieve a higher level of ascension? Is this really the fate of humanity? That humans and mutants are essentially going to be wiped out and they're going to be replaced by robot biological being hybrids. This is kind of an important thing here because if you go back and you look at Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers, and I know I keep saying that, everything from this Fantastic Four all the way up until now is all one giant cohesive story, right? And so when you look at that, you say, okay, you have the portion of the story where Captain America and Black Widow and Hawkeye and I think somebody else, I can't remember, get flung into the future. And along the way, they basically start dropping off. But you get 50,000 years into the future, and you basically end up realizing that, like, the Avengers transcend the Earth and become this universal protection force, right? So, like, there's a future there. But how do you get from point A to point B? And will that future come to fruition? That's really what's being presented to us here by Jonathan Hickman. And that's really the question that we have to ask. Okay, so we are picking up with House of X Part 5. And this is actually one of the coolest things because like a lot of crazy things happen in this, and everything changes in its entirety, right? So like I just want to kind of dive right into this. So what we do here is we initially pick up with Lorna Dane and with Magneto. Now the cool thing about this is that remember, where Lorna Dane is exceedingly powerful and she has the powers of Magneto for all intents and purposes, there is still a lot of learning that goes on there with insofar as the role that Magneto plays and how people works and all that kind of stuff. So sort of passing this wisdom on is a bit of a cool thing because what ends up happening is she asks the question, is there any good in humanity? And Magneto responds to this by saying, well, there was a point where humanity was composed of hunters and gatherers, right? It was a nomadic setup where humans would just travel from one place to the next. They would basically forage for food or resources or what have you, and then move on to the next. It wasn't until humanity sort of settling near bodies of water and then sort of forming civilizations around those bodies of water and then expanding in and out of direction that they basically created society. And in doing that, they, of course, pass that on to humankind. Not in a literal sense, but in the sense that humankind can basically follow the path of humanity and find a refuge unto itself, ideally the island of Krakoa. So again, like it's kind of interesting because what ends up happening is you basically have what's called the coming together of the five. And it's a really cool concept because what this means is there are 5 mutants that have been brought here selectively by Charles Xavier himself. And the reason is because they serve 5 particular purposes. So the first person here is Fabio Medina. Now Fabio Medina was a character, or is a character rather, who creates these kind of like golden balls, which nobody ever really seemed to care about. What you end up finding out is they were actually eggs. Now, what Hickman doesn't explain here is if these eggs are created and if these eggs are planted somewhere, will they gestate given enough time, or are they simply unfertilized? Will they sort of wither and die and go away if they never fertilize at all? Or will they just sit there for all time waiting to be fertilized? We're not really good at answering that question, but it's kind of cool because we don't need one. Instead, we're basically doing this scenario to where you have Proteus, the son of Norman McTaggart, who can again manipulate reality in a localized space. We've made videos of that and we've talked about them, so you'll find those down in the description. But using the reality warping abilities of Proteus, and then using some of the preserved DNA, which we'll talk about that here in a second, as well as using an elixir who can basically give life. What this does is it allows them to in turn use the powers of Eva Bell to manipulate time and then speed up the gestation process and essentially create new mutants. Now, this is one of the reasons why reading everything that Hickman does is exceedingly important because when you look at this, you say, okay, well, where'd they get the DNA from? We got that last little tidbit from the last comic, right? Where like Charles Xavier basically asked Mr. Sinister to create a giant repository of mutant DNA. This is why, so that at a future point in time, he could start resurrecting X-Men. And that's basically what he does. He recreates all the X-Men who died on the facility, on the satellite, during their initial launch. Now, it may seem kind of like a hand-wavy thing and a way to just kind of be like, well, whatever, and just kind of like bring a character back from the dead in a really convenient manner. Right? I mean, some people will look at it that way. Hickman is never that way, right? This is designed to introduce a concept. This is designed to introduce a way in which a mutant can return and do it in a fashion to where it'll become exceedingly important later on down the line, right? So to a degree, it is a bit hand-wavy, but this is also one of those moments where you have to to keep this in the back of your head, because if you don't, then you'll basically get lost in the shuffle in however long it takes for Hickman to get around to it during Braun Bucks. But it's kind of a cool little thing, because following that, what we also get is this explanation about Cerebro. And over the years, Cerebro had always been billed in Marvel Comics as this device that was developed through a combination of Charles Xavier and Magneto and so on, that would allow him to find any mutant around the world. What Cerebro can actually do is it's basically been copying the mental patterns of X-Men all across the entirety of this existence, right? And so what this does is it allows the DNA, as it was kept by Mr. Sinister, to resurrect the physical bodies of the X-Men. And then in turn, the information stored in Cerebro allows him to basically reinstall the mind, so to speak, of the person who was created, right? Now, again, this is not Hickman making this up. We saw this happen in the Iron Man comics. So we've seen this happen a multitude of times over the years in Marvel Comics, whereby a person's mind can be more or less backed up. And when that person dies, if they're recreated, their mind can be reinstalled back into their brain, and they'll go back as they normally would, right? They'll go back completely functional. And so it's kind of a cool thing, because what you get here is the return of all these X-Men who died, right? You get the return of Wolverine, you get the return of Nightcrawler, of Jean Grey, of Cyclops. All these characters, Monet St. Croix, the whole 9 yards, all these characters that died have all basically been brought back. And so it's one of these cool things, because Storm basically goes out there and speaks to the people of Krakoa on behalf of Xavier and Magneto and all of them, and says, like, these people have been recreated, and I know there's some degree of distrust, right? You don't know if it's truly them. You know it's a mutant, but you don't know if it's truly them. So let me verify. And by kind of going through and testing each one, they all pass. In the sense that Cyclops makes reference to, I thought I knew what it meant to be like a Storm leader, and then you showed me that's a reference to when Cyclops battled Storm for the leadership of the X-Men and Storm won, and then Cyclops basically left. So that was back during the old Chris Claremont and Luis and Roger Simonson and Bob Layton eras of Uncanny X-Men and X-Factor. In turn, you basically end up getting, like, Jean Grey who's tested, you have Monet St. Croix who's tested. She's kind of like, get your hands off me. Each one of these mutants are individually tested. Each one of them are tested in a way to verify that they are who they claim to be. And it's really a way for Hickman to tell us this is really them. Right? It's not just like duplicates, or I guess it is to a degree, but they're not like it's not a false Cyclops. Right? It's not a fake Monet St. Croix or a fake Jean Grey. This is actually them. This is really and truly them. And so it's kind of a cool thing, because where Xavier would be excited about this, and where he would celebrate this moment, the reality is that they're all basically hinging on a vote from the United Nations to decide whether or not to see Krakoa as an actual sovereign nation, right? Like, is it its own island, like its own country where only mutants reside? Now, this is an important theme, because it's Magneto basically pulling a bit of history out of Marvel Comics. And the reason why I say that is that if you go back and you read X-Men Volume 2, issue number 87, that was a story whereby Magneto basically sees the magnetic poles of Earth, and then basically blackmailed humanity into giving mutants their own island, which, of course, turned out to be Genosha. And so it's not the first time something like this has happened, and it's not Hickman just pulling things out of the backside. Now, there are vast differences between Genosha and Krakoa. Like, Krakoa is a living island. Genosha was just a giant chunk of land out there somewhere. So, again, there are big differences. This would be a far more safe place than Genosha ever was, but it is kind of a cool moment, because what you end up doing is getting to, like, the actual day of the vote, and it's kind of a blessing, but a curse at the same time, because the votes ultimately pass. Like you basically have Krakoa going forward as a nation. The issue with this, in the way it worked, was that Emma Frost essentially swayed the vote using her telepathic powers. And Charles Xavier basically says, hey, look, we appreciate everything you've done, just know, things like this always come at a cost. And while it's not really made clear by Jonathan Hickman, what this basically means is that somewhere along the line, someone's going to realize people's minds were tampered with. And while the vote has really just kind of gone through, and there's not much they can do to undo it, I guess they could try to vote against it, kind of ban them, take away their nation. But what that would do, if that were the case, is it would lead to a war between humans and mutants, right? Because it would basically be humanity saying, all right, all you mutants now have a place of your own, and then saying, never mind, no you don't, and then taking it back, right? So, I mean, here's a safe haven, never mind, now you have to clean through your lives all over again, and it just wouldn't work, right? And so what this does with Krakoa now being listed as an actual sanctuary, a livable sanctuary, an island that's governed and occupied only by mutants, and the only people that can get in that are not mutants are those that mutants allow to get in, basically brings in a whole host of different people. And so you've got Mr. Sinister and his Marauders, you've got Benedict Harry, which is actually really cool to see Exodus here, and you have Apocalypse. And this is one of the coolest moments here, because Apocalypse showing up is just kind of like, wow, like this is wild. Because remember, when it comes to Apocalypse, outside of what we saw in that future conflict where he was defeated by Nimrod, which I still don't agree with, I still think Apocalypse could have defeated Nimrod. I feel like he should have. I feel like Nimrod's just not powerful enough to defeat Apocalypse. That's me as a fan talking with no factual evidence to back that up outside of the powers that Apocalypse has. But I feel like Apocalypse should have won that battle.
Yeah.
But Apocalypse showing up here is a big thing, because we would expect him to show up and then instigate conflict, to test those individuals those who believe that they're powerful enough, when in reality he's actually showing up here clearly but not. Of course, yes, as we look at Poe, we talk about that in the last video, and so we really show them to this island more as a friend. And when he's speaking with Magneto and speaking with Lorraine, Magneto says, we need to hear you say that basically you're not going to cause trouble here, because if you are going to cause trouble, then we'll kick you out, right? We'll just have to throw a banish you. And it's kind of cool because his response is, no, I'm not here to cause problems. You all turn out to be exactly what I wanted you to be. Over the years, over my entire existence, I've pitted the weak against the strong in an effort to eliminate the weak. Like, you guys in this point right now have become the strong. You've literally moved away from the point where you're falling prey to this ideology of, well, we can help them see the error of their ways. We can, if we're nice enough, we can get them to change their minds, right? I mean, that doesn't work, right? I mean, if you're nice enough, all you're going to do is get caught. And so, like in this instance, it's kind of like you guys have finally woken up to the reality of the world, that being nice is just not the way that it works, right? Like, the world's filled with nice people, and none of them ever really get anything done, right? I mean, it's all those individuals who are willing to do whatever needs to be done in order to get things done that end up getting things done. And he's like, you've woken up to this reality. You've woken up to the way things are, to the way the world is. You have become what I always wanted you to be. You are now the strong. And so it's a cool thing, because when he finally conceives and says, from this day forward, I'm not Apocalypse standing alone. I am part of you. Basically, Apocalypse joins the X-Men. And it's the coolest thing ever, because what Xavier says is, if that's the case, then welcome home. Okay, so getting into Powers of X Part 5, like, we are getting to a point where the series is wrapping up. The series is coming to an end. And I am very much excited about this, because I'm really curious to see, not even because, I'm not really excited because it's ending, I'm excited because I want to know where it goes next, right? I mean, I'm kind of sad it's ending, to be honest, because it's been an amazing story so far. But what this does is it initially picks up with Forge. Now, here's the thing. Here's the funny thing. I feel like only the most steadfast and staunchest of X-Men fans would know this, but Jonathan Hickman is not pulling this out of nowhere. And here's the cool thing. So initially, Charles Xavier meets with Forge to basically upgrade Cerebro. This is one of the reasons why Hickman writing is so good, is because it ties into everything, right? So if you come into this and you haven't really read the X-Men, or you're not really familiar with the X-Men, the idea is, okay, cool. So somewhere along the lines, like, Xavier asked Forge to basically upgrade Cerebro, and like, but Cerebro was originally made by Xavier, so like, Hickman's changing the past. No, that's not true. If you go back and you read X-Men Volume 2, issue number 5, there's a point where Xavier approaches Forge and basically says, you're a mutant with the ability to basically be Tony Stark, more or less, right? Like, that's his power, right? His power is that he can basically understand machinery and how it works, all that kind of cool stuff. That's why, like, Forge is basically the X-Men's version of Tony Stark. The difference is that Forge if he lost his powers, he'd be no more capable of understanding machinery than, like, complex machinery that we can't do it either. But the fact remains that during that second run of X-Men, like X-Men Volume 2, basically what ended up happening is, in the aftermath of everything that happened with the Phoenix Saga, the Dark Phoenix Sagas, and all that kind of stuff, that Xavier basically approached Forge and asked him to upgrade Cerebro using Shi'ar technology. And so what this shows is basically how we got to that point, right? Like, where Xavier basically walks up on Forge and says, I need you to show me how it is that you I need you to upgrade Cerebro with Shi'ar technology. And the reason why is actually a little bit different. So beforehand, it was simply just like, the system needs to be upgraded, right? Like, we need to have a better reach and a stronger understanding of it. But beforehand, it was a way for Marvel to basically kind of bring the X-Men into, like, the modern age of storytelling, essentially, and really kind of upgrading everything across the board. The reason why it's actually happening here is because with what it is that Xavier wants to do, Cerebro is simply not powerful enough. But when it comes to the Shi'ar technology that's out there, it definitely is. That Xavier essentially wants to have a system of redundancy, right? He wants to have a system to where he can copy the minds of all the mutants in existence. Now, we know that from the last House of X video, but the question was, how did we get to that point, and how does it work, and how can it last for the long term? And that's what Forge says. Forge is like, well, what you're asking here is not something as simple as, I want to copy the minds of all beings in existence. It's a lot more nuanced than that. Like, one, you need to be able to basically have an unlimited amount of story, right? Because what you're talking about doing is backing up the minds of an individual person, and then in turn having to back it up on a regular basis, right? Because what happens if you back up the mind of someone and then they turn evil, and then they die, but you want to bring them back? If the only version that you have is the most recent one, which is their evil version, you're going to bring back the evil version of themselves. Instead, you want to go back to, like, back in the dead. You can pick which version of themselves that you want to bring back in this new body that you would essentially be creating for them. And so if you do that, like, you're going to need a vast amount of storage, because you're talking about mapping and storing the human psyche, which, as anybody will tell you, takes a little bit more than a thumb drive. And then from there, you're talking about having a system of redundancy, meaning that you're going to have multiple backups, so that you don't have to worry about if one of them goes down or gets destroyed, that you've lost all your data. So what you're talking about is an unlimited amount of information stored on an unlimited amount of storage. Like, how in the world do you expect to pull this off? Nothing on Earth exists like that. And that's when Xavier says, yes, but the Shi'ar are really, like, they're way beyond humanity in terms of technology. Like, they can store unlimited amounts of information and basically keep their technology going on forever. Hence the reason why they're an entire galactic spanning civilization that's conquered multiple civilizations and forced them all to worship them. So it's basically like, I want 5 backups for this whole system. It's cool. And it's really interesting to see this exchange between the two, because ultimately Xavier ends up asking, like, you're the only real people on our side that I can trust with this. Like, are you going to be able to make this work? Are you going to be able to pull this off? And ultimately, of course, as we know from X-Men history, Forge says yes. Now, here's the important thing to bear in mind. It could be that the Hickman comes back and changes that. That's one thing to always bear in mind when it comes to what it is that Hickman's doing. Just because things were a certain way doesn't mean they will be that way. And I mean, the guy's basically rebooting the X-Men for really the modern age. He could change anything at any point in time. So take it with a grain of salt. It's not an absolute form and function and structure or anything like that. Now, from this point, this is why I love Hickman world building, right? Because imagine this, but on like a much grander scale. And that's basically how Hickman writes long form stories, right? So like 3, 4, 5 new runs on the X-Men or the Fantastic Four or the Avengers and New Avengers. That's basically how this works. And so if you recall, one of the ways in which Krakoa was able to operate as a nation state and generate income was by using the various leaves of the various plant life that was there to synthesize drugs that could do things like extend human life by 5 years or cure all mental illnesses and different things like that. Now, something else that's really intriguing is the way he shines a light on Xavier here, because Xavier basically travels to the Louvre alongside Magneto and usually uses his telepathic powers, forces everybody to leave, and then meets with Emma Frost. And remember, this is kind of a cool concept, because the way it seems to be going right now, Emma Frost still has dealings with the Hellfire Club, right? So she's kind of on again, off again with the X-Men. It's not where she was during like Grant Morrison's run, where she's like a full-on member of the X-Men. She's kind of out doing her own thing at the moment. Now, a lot of this probably comes out of X-Men versus Inhumans and the fact that what she's done had basically been revealed, but Hickman hasn't really tied into that, so there's no reason to believe that's the absolute case. But the fact remains that what ends up happening is Xavier basically tells her, like, you're aware of the fact that Krakoa is basically creating medicines out there that can essentially shut down and really ruin the entire pharmaceutical industry and the rest of the world. Like, you're aware that that's what we're doing, right? Like, we're basically pumping out various medicines and cures that the pharmaceutical company doesn't really seem to be interested in doing, because they're putting profits over progression. And so because of that, like, we've basically stepped in where they failed, and we've essentially dominated the market. And we've shut off pretty much every access point where anybody can top of us, right? Like, we own the means of production, we keep the means of production secret. No one gets in or out of Krakoa unless they let them. So it's not like humanity could send in a spy. It's not like the pharmaceutical industry could send in a spy and get all this information on how to duplicate these drugs, and then in turn send them out there, because even then they would need Krakoa to make them. So any drug they created would be a half measure. Humanity would sniff it out fast, they would turn on it, and it would go back to using the drugs that are coming out of Krakoa, various medicines coming out of them. And so it's like we've essentially dominated and cornered this market in its entirety. What we need is the means to be able to get into countries that have a big population and countries that have rejected our offer. And this is what's so really nefarious about what it is that Xavier's doing, because what he basically tells Emma Frost is, I need you to get back into contact with Sebastian Shaw. I need you to rejoin the Hellfire Club. And it's just kind of like, wow, because it's like, you will be the front phase operation. You'll get 50%, you'll get a 50-year contract with a more than fair share of money that's generated here. And then in turn, she'll be the public face. She'll be the marketing face, right? She'll be the one you see on TV and the commercials. And I'm Emma Frost. You want to live 5 more years and then take this drug for Krakoa, or different things like that. What will really go on is with the Black King, with Sebastian Shaw, because of the fact that he is, by all intents and purposes, a criminal. He's a bad guy, but he still has a lot of contacts and a lot of reach due to the fact that Hellfire Club really immersed itself in what was essentially world domination, albeit behind the scenes. That what Sebastian Shaw can do is get their drugs into these countries that have rejected the offers of Krakoa by using like black book operations, and then in turn get mutants out and get the drugs in. It's a pretty nefarious plan, because what it basically means is flooding countries with the Krakoan drugs, and it's pretty sinister. Like, it's pretty dark. Xavier's becoming like a drug kingpin. It's essentially what it is. Now, it's interesting because Xavier masks it behind the perception of, well, it's all in the effort of getting mutants out and basically getting them back home to Krakoa. But it seems that even then, it's pretty dark. And this is actually really cool. I dig this because what it shows is that Xavier's willing to do whatever needs to be done in order to get his business back home, right? I mean, that's one of the things we've talked about recently. The people who win the wars are the ones that do what needs to be done to win the war. Not the guy trying to change the hearts and minds. That doesn't work. But it's cool. It works really effectively because, well, at the end of the day, Emma Frost basically says, yes, I'll side with you on this. I'll help you make this happen. We will find a way to pull this off. And that's why it's so awesome. That's why you see this really cool concept, because what they also do is they say, we want to bring you on, we want to give you 2 seats on the Quiet Council of Krakoa. Basically a council of 12 that's leading the Krakoan mutant population. Basically the entirety of the mutant population. All going to be led by a council of 12. Magneto and Professor X, of course, will be named after the seasons. Magneto and Professor X are going to be, 2 of the 3. We don't know the other ones. And then we know that Sebastian Shaw and Emma Frost are going to take 2 spots. And then Emma Frost is asking for a 3rd. We have no idea who that one's going to go to. It'd be awesome if we went to Hellion if they brought it back. But nonetheless, at this point, it basically is kind of like this telepathic message sent out to Xavier, which gives us the reason why all these mutants appeared on Krakoa in the last issue. It's basically saying, like, we are working on a thing. Like, Krakoa will become your home if you choose to accept it. If you want to be here, you'll be safe from all prying knowledge. You'll be safe from all forms of humanity's oppression. This would be a safe space for you. Notice here that what Xavier's basically doing here is Avalon, right? Avalon, Providence, whatever you want to call it, from Magneto's history when he created, like, Asteroid N, and basically brought all the mutants, or as many mutants as we leave Earth. Xavier opposed it at that point in time. It was like, that's a terrible idea. We have to have the peaceful coexistence between humans and mutants. What Xavier seems to have recently done, or done in recent years, is understand that, like, sometimes you can't change the hearts and minds of people, and you never should have tried in the first place. That what you should have done was just said, hey, look, if that's how you want it to be, that's fine. We won't always go over here, but understand. Like, let me make this clear in no uncertain terms. You stay away, we stay away. If you come over to where we're at, then we're gonna bring everything you know and love to ruin, right? While everything that you know and love burns down around you in ash, you're gonna have to look and accept the fact you did this to yourself. At the end of the day, it's basically keeping all the population safeguarded by whatever means necessary. Now, a funny thing that kind of goes on here, this is why I love the way that John Hickman writes Namor the Submariner. Namor the Submariner gets a message, of course, from Xavier, because Namor was a mutant. And so as a result of that, Namor, of course, being a proud king, the king of Atlantis, is told by Xavier, why in the world would I accept your offer? You want to play king, and that's cute, and that's fine, but boy, I've been a king for eons. Like, I've been a king for a long time. So while it's nice that you want to do this, you hardly know what it means. So you don't really understand what you're asking. You don't know what you're creating. You're just doing a thing. Whereas I understand what it really means to be a king. So if you want to give me your offer, that's fine, but come back when you're serious. Come back when you actually mean it, and you actually know what you're talking about. Dude, I love Namor. I love the way that Hickman writes Namor, because he's so arrogant and so haughty. It's so awesome just to see Namor written in such a really cool way. But again, jumping 1,000 years in the future, in the last few issues or so, we had basically talked about how this new elevated form of what was, I should say, kind of a combination of humanity and machinery, had basically moved in the direction of wanting to be absorbed by the Phalanx, right? They're kind of becoming part of this universal consciousness. They're basically going out and becoming something great, a higher state of enlightenment or entropy or whatever it is you want to call it. It was a cool thing, because with them reaching this point and the Phalanx arriving, the question was, if we essentially put our consciousness into a pure machine shell, as opposed to, part human and part machine, are you guys going to accept that? And the response of the Phalanx is now given when they say, yes, we find this acceptable. We find it acceptable that because you were bred as a combination between whatever your biological race was, which was human, and machinery being merged together as a cyborg reaching its current form of enlightenment, you're not truly a machine. And we, as the Phalanx, only absorb, like, machine-based entities. So put your consciousness in a machine, and you can come hang out. Like, it's basically what it comes down to. And it works, because as soon as that happens, the Elder's basically eradicated by the entirety, or at least by this particular Phalanx force. And when the question is asked by the librarian, when it's talking to this future version of Nimrod, why is it the Elder was destroyed? Nimrod basically responds by saying, when it comes to the Phalanx, there's simply just but one phase out there. And this is Hickman doing a huge amount of work with. Because what Hickman basically says is that throughout the entirety of the universe, you have black holes. And what conventional wisdom would tell us that black holes are just giant gravity wells, right? Collapsed dead stars could suck in everything around it, including light, and nothing gets in, and it just gets broken down on the atomic level, and then who the hell knows what happens in the center of it, because it's all theoretical, but you haven't been there before. But what he actually says here is that these black holes are essentially collapsed dead civilizations, right? Like entire intellectual civilizations whose entire overall knowledge and experience and everything just collapsed in on itself. Basically, it got so smart, it collapsed in on itself. And when that happened, it basically created a kind of fissure in space-time. But each one is not really alone. Instead, it's part of a greater whole. And this greater whole is this giant series of networks. So essentially, every single black hole in the universe is one part of this giant collective consciousness. And so because of that, like, it's all networked. And the phalanx in turn come under that. You know, and it's a cool concept, because what it basically means is that it's literally the universe's own intelligence, more or less. It's a cool thing, because what this means is that this kind of higher level of thinking, that it starts out that if you want to kind of piece these things together, this is why Jonathan Hickman is such an amazing writer. If you piece these things together, what you have are baseline symbols. From baseline symbols, you go to mother, or you go to master modes. From master modes, you go to mother modes. From mother modes, you go to like actual like omega symbols, right? So basically a blending between human and machine. From there, you go on to a higher level, which is the Nimrod, and then from the Nimrod, you go on to yet even higher levels. If they get high enough, they achieve if they achieve a state of enlightenment, they end up getting to their current form, and then from there, they merge with the phalanx, and then merging with the phalanx goes on to become an even bigger part of an empire, whose the phalanx themselves serve this absolute intelligence across the universe. It's an awesome sort of introduction, right? Because, you know, Hickman really breaks this down. You've got the Technarch, you've got the World Mind, you've got the Phalanx, you've got Titans, you've got the Stronghold, and then you've got a Dominion, right? So kind of going from like the baseline and then building it all the way back up here. There are multiple threats, right? There are multiple concepts. They really all kind of seem to lead to this final level of super intelligence. It's a cool concept. I'm digging it. Man, let me tell y'all something. 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 All right. Look, here's the thing, folks. All right. Here's the thing. House of X's. House of X's. And it is legit. Oh, hey, by the way, what is it right now? It's around 8:30 a.m. Mountain Time. So that's 10:30 a.m. Standard Time, or Eastern Standard Time. So we'll say at about 11:30 a.m., give or take time for my editor to edit the video, for it to go up, and for you guys to be able to watch it. We'll say 11:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. I will be live on Twitch. Twitch.tv/IamRobJefferson. Coming out, we'll do like a live Q&A while I'm playing Destiny 2. It'll be pretty awesome. Okay, so here's the thing, right? Okay, so I am hyped for the conclusion of House of X. Like dude, this is, okay. Obviously, Hickman set stuff in place for like the dawn of X, right? And I told people he was man, let me tell you something. I've been in the X for 25 years, folks. I know what I'm talking about. I told people this was going to happen, right? I told people this is exactly what's going to happen. That Jonathan Hickman is going to plant the seeds for like dawn of X, right? It's not just going to end. It's not going to be a self-contained thing. It's like it's basically like Dark Reign, the Fantastic Four, right? Like if you want to understand Jonathan Hickman's Fantastic Four run, you have to cover the Fantastic Four Dark Reign story, and maybe we should, right? Like maybe we should, but like if you want to understand Hickman's run, you have to cover that, because like that's the beginning of it all. That's how it all starts. So here's the thing, man. Like okay, so initially this picks up down in like the Citadel, right? Because the big question people have had here is, where is Moira McTaggart, right? Like, where's Moira McTaggart in all of this stuff that we see in House of X? Because in all the other alternate realities, all the other lives that she's lived, whatever you want to call them, like, she's always been there. Where's she at? We haven't seen her once this entire time. And there's been all these theories floating around. Like, I saw theories in the comment section where people were saying that Professor Xavier is actually Moira McTaggart. Like, which is a cool theory. It's wrong, but it's a cool theory, all right? Moira McTaggart is there. And here's a crazy thing. There's really kind of like this discussion between Moira and Magneto and Xavier, where they basically say, if we do this, if we start this process, there's no going back here. Like, if we do this, if we start this process, there's no going back. There's no unringing this bell, right? Like, we'll cross the line that we can't come back from. And Xavier's response is, I understand. Like, I get what it is. It's coming. So literally, it's the coolest thing in the world. See, this is why I love Jonathan Hickman, right? Because Jonathan Hickman is really, really good at doing these scenarios where, like, a character who's really powerful will basically go out to the world and just be like, you're all screwed. Like, you are all screwed. I love this. Okay, so you have to understand the X-Men history, right? Like, the X-Men have constantly been persecuted, cast off, been manipulated, been screwed over, been left hanging over and over and over and over again, constantly happening in the realm of Marvel Comics, right? Like, humanity's always stood idly by and either let them be attacked or actually gone after them themselves, right? The Friends of Humanity, right? Like, all these other groups, the Purifiers and the Marauders and Mr. Sinister, like, even the superhero community, like the Avengers and so on, even most of them just kind of stood by and not really done anything. Cyclops made that point in Avengers versus X-Men, right? You guys remember that conversation between Cyclops and Captain America, and even talking to like Reed Richards, it's kind of like, you guys have willfully stood by and let us be persecuted. You guys have willfully stood by and let these groups come after us and eliminate our kind. And where were you during the events of ES4 Extinction? Where were the Avengers to help rescue us during the ES4 Extinction? Where were the Avengers during the events, during the story arc of God Loves Man Kills? Where were you when we had the Purifiers coming after us, when we had the Right coming after us, and the Friends of Humanity coming coming after us and Factor 3 coming after us. Where were you when all this was going on? And so it's so cool because at this point, humanity's like, we've had enough. I'm sorry, humanity's like, we've had enough. We're done. So Xavier puts on his helmet, right? Puts on his helmet and addresses the world and says, world, humanity. Here's the deal. In the coming days, in the coming months, and in the coming period of time, you will learn that we here, mutants on the island of Krakoa, have basically created drugs here that are pharmaceutical fountains of youth, basically, right? They can cure people of most cancers. They can extend your life by 5 years. They can cure most mental illness. Now, there was a time when I would have just given you these drugs, because what I wanted was a peaceful coexistence between humans and mutants. What I wanted was for us to be able to bond together. Now keep in mind, the whole of the superhero community and all of humanity is listening to this. She's like, there was a time when all I wanted was peace, but you didn't want that. The superheroes let us die time and time again. You as humanity either came after us or stood by and did nothing. So I'm not giving you anything. I'm not giving you any drugs. You're going to have to live your life as best you can. If you want them, you have to pay for them. And it's just like, dude, this is legit. Because it's Xavier just like sticking that knife in and just being like you could have had the life. You could have had this dream. You could have had things. Like you could have had the perfect world. But instead, you had to be idiots. Instead, you had to be selfish. You had to be vile. And you had to be cruel. And you had to turn your guns on us despite the fact that we'd really done nothing wrong. And so because of that, if you want these drugs, if you want to be able to have these things, then there are two forms of payments that come into this. The first is you have to accept that Krakoa is going to be a nation state unto itself, that we're basically going to be autonomous, that we do not answer to any existing government out there aside from the United Nations. We are on par with China and the United States and all of these various nations that exist out there that govern themselves. And so long as they don't violate things like the Geneva Conventions, then we're fine. The second is that at birth, the moment they are born, any mutant out there in the world can claim Krakoa as citizenship, which means if your child grows to be 13 years old and his or her mutant powers manifest, and they're reading online about how the island of Krakoa is a nation state, they can, at that point in time, say, I want to be a citizen of Krakoa, and leave, and there's nothing their parents can do to stop them. That any mutant anywhere can make that claim, and they are now protected under the laws of Krakoa, that the laws of man no longer affect mutants. It's a crazy thing. Like if you want these drugs, if you want to be able to improve your life, you have to be able, like you have to do this. Now, here's the thing: is it's kind of reading between the lines. It's because it's sort of like, and if you decide to make a move against us, all hell's gonna break loose. It's one of the coolest things. You know, he's like, from this day forward, mutant kind is governed by mutant laws, not mankind's laws. These are not negotiable terms. There's no sitting down at a table and getting us to basically finagle and change our minds or anything like that. Like, this is basically how it's going to be. We're asking you for a better life, and in return, we will give you the same. Like, that's basically how this is going to work. And it's so like, this is the best part, right? This is the best part right here. He basically says, if you find yourself in a position asking the question, who are we as mutants to make terms like this? We're the future, right? Like, for countless eons, you as human beings have gone to bed and woke up believing the world would be the same, believing the world would be as it always was. That's not true. We are Earth's true inheritors. We are the next step in human evolution. So here's the reality of the world that you live in. While you slept, the world changed. And it's just like, dude, like, it's one of the coolest things. Xavier's not pulling any punches, man. It's crazy. He really feels like Magneto here. It's like, dude, this is awesome, man. Like, this is legit. Here's the thing, too. We end up getting, like, the Quiet Council of Krakoa, like, the full-on council of the 12, basically, albeit we're missing a single person, like a Red King, right? So we get Professor X, Magneto, and Apocalypse. This is going to be the coolest thing, because here's, like, man, let me tell you something. Apocalypse, man, the Apocalypse, like, once you get to the end of this story, like, the end of this issue, Apocalypse, dude, it's just kind of like, okay, Apocalypse, I see you, man. Like, I see what's going on. Like, it's legit. Then you get Mr. Sinister, you get Exodus, and you get Mystique, right? Now, Mr. Sinister is pretty self-explanatory. We have a video explaining him. We don't have a video explaining Exodus. Basically, Exodus is a super powerful telepathic telekinetic, right? Like, he's way up there in terms of his powers. It's nuts what all he can do. But he, like Mr. Sinister, was created by the villain Apocalypse. And of course, Mystique speaks for itself. You got Sebastian Shaw and Emma Frost, which I love those choices because Sebastian Shaw is basically a guy who just turns any kind of energy or attack that's made against him into like physical strength. Not to mention he's got all kinds of fingers in different pies, you know, that he's been involved in over the years and really has a lot of influence and pull throughout the world. Emma Frost is the exact same way. Storm, Jean Grey, and Nightcrawler. This is a cool choice because this is like the original X-Men basically, or at least not the original, but like the giant-sized X-Men more or less. So it's a great callback to that. And then of course you've got Cypher, who's speaks for Krakoa, and Krakoa being the island they all basically reside on. Now, this actually goes directly into the first meeting of the council, the first meeting of the 12. And it's one of the coolest things, because as this all basically begins to go into discussion, what they end up doing is bringing out their first prisoner, their first actor in the council, which is an action of judgment. And the person they end up bringing out is Sabretooth. Now remember, Sabretooth was the one who was sent on a mission by Xavier and all them into the world, and then basically kind of went forward with his own agenda. And once he was caught up to by Mystique and all them, they brought him back. But we saw that earlier in the House of X storyline. And so it's crazy, because what you end up basically getting is kind of this debate that begins to run on between all these different guys. This kind of discussion that takes place. And the question is, if we are a nation that believes that it's wrong for humanity to take our lives, then we have to in turn believe the opposite, that it's wrong for us to take the lives of humans. Now in reality, this is more of a safeguarding thing, right? If humanity begins to come to the belief that Krakoa is really nothing more than a warring nation state, it's one of these places where mutants are gathering forces so they can eventually launch attack against humanity, and there's incredible reason to believe that, well then humans will strike first. It's just the way that it is. But if they kind of uphold this rule that we are a nation that basically we don't attack humans and humans don't attack us, they stay away and we stay away, it creates an uneasy alliance. It still works and it still serves its purpose. But it's one of those things where it's kind of like we can't basically decide, like we can't be the judge, jury, and executioner for a group of people out there who don't follow our laws. But at the same time, are we going to be the kind of people who execute our own rules? Like, is that the role that we're going to play? Because if we create this place to safeguard the mutant population and then start executing them for crimes that they commit, is that okay? And so basically what they end up doing is kind of sitting down and creating these kind of laws of Krakoa, basically. These laws that they're all going to follow. These laws that they're all going to obey. And so where you end up having this sort of discussion taking place and Sabretooth watching it unfold, Sabretooth begins to come to the realization or the belief that the entire council begins to kill. From there, it starts getting into a discussion of like what's really home, right? I mean, like from Storm's perspective, and the way she makes the argument, home really is a matter of possession, right? You possess your home, you own your home, therefore you live inside your home. But because of the fact that Krakoa is inherently a mutant, and Krakoa is providing them with a dwelling, a place to live, it's actually Cypher who kind of makes that argument on behalf of Krakoa, that technically it would be ownership of a mutant. And so because of that, it kind of begins to beg the question, if Krakoa is going to allow them a place to live, a place of residency of sorts, then can they truly in turn call it something that they own? And if they do, can they treat it like something that they own? That is to say, just treat it however they want to. And the answer to that question is no, that's not the case. And so by virtue of all these discussions that are going on, what they do is create three laws, the three laws of Krakoa. Make more mutants, which is to say, grow their ranks. Because right now, our numbers are severely limited. So somewhere along the line, humanity is going to make an attack. Humanity is going to strike. And when they do, we need to have a mutant population large enough to be able to withstand such an attack. The second thing is murder no man. Do not murder humanity unless they put us in a situation where we have to, right? So defending our land is just cause to murder a human. Murdering them really like Sabretooth did, that's not okay. And then third, respect the sacred land. Respect the land of Krakoa. These are three basic and fundamental, but exceedingly important laws. Because it's really one of these things where by the grace of Krakoa goes the mutant population, right? They serve at the pleasure of Krakoa. At any point in time, he could just kick them all out or just sink himself, and they would have nowhere to live. Whatever the case is, any number of things could happen. He could turn on them. There's a whole bunch of things that can take place. And so it's respect the land of Krakoa. Respect the house in which we're being given residence. That's basically how this whole thing goes down. So then they start asking the question, if one of the sacred laws is we cannot kill any man outside of the fence, that is to say, you're basically trying to get away, and there's no way for us to get away, meaning they corner us or something like that, or they attack our sacred land, then like what do we do with Sabretooth? And the response is, well, we can't just kill him. Instead, we are going to exile him. And so what they do is really, really cool here, because the initial response would be, if we're going to exile him, just send him out into space. Just send him out into the world. The problem with this is that if they did that, one, they would basically like sending him to suicide, somebody somewhere would try to kill him. And two, while that probably wouldn't work, what he could do is dump all his knowledge about Krakoa and the goings on in society out into the highest bidder, give it to the government, different things like that, and literally become the means by which the entire island of Krakoa would just come crashing down around, literally just become the linchpin that pulls that they just pull out, and the whole thing comes crashing down. And so what they end up doing is exiling him deep down inside of Krakoa itself. They literally lock him away down inside of this living island. And so it's kind of nuts, because from there they basically like celebrate their safe haven. taken. They celebrate the place they're in, right? It's just kind of like, okay, let us go forward from here. And mutants, like all these mutants who arrived here, and mutants who are arriving every single day, all these mutants who are showing up here are celebrating this newfound freedom that they have. And it's interesting that Hickman's building it up, because he's building it up in such a way to where they're celebrating freedom, they're celebrating living in a place where they don't have to worry about being persecuted by humanity. And where you have like Xavier and Magneto who are talking with one another, and who are basically sort of enjoying this moment and saying, look at this world that we've created. What you've got is Apocalypse watching it all go down. And here is my question. Here's my question, Rob Ford. Here's what I want. Here's what I want to know. Because I feel like things are about to pop off. Here's what I want to know. Yes, Apocalypse is on the council. Yes, Apocalypse is there to observe. But is Apocalypse, is he going to step in? When the time comes when humanity shows up on the doorstep of Krakoa and just starts unleashing all kinds of craziness, is Apocalypse going to act? Or will Apocalypse stand down and simply just say, whoever survives this whole thing is worthy, like they're worthy of continued existence? Like those mutants who were there. If you cannot survive and protect your own land, you were never worthy of living in the first place, right? His philosophy of social Darwinism. That's what I want to know. Or is Apocalypse, does he have more nefarious plans? It is legit. I love this story. All right, people, we are here. Let me tell y'all something. Now, I'm standing up in my recording space right now. I'm not even next to the microphone, man, like the soundproof room. I'm standing in here and I've got the chair in my hand. Let me tell y'all something, man. Let me tell y'all something, man. We are here at the conclusion of Powers of X. Let me tell y'all something. This is, let me tell y'all something. This is why I love Jonathan Hickman, man. Because you're like you read Jonathan Hickman, you read Jonathan Hickman's stories, and it's like, man, I have it all figured out, and I know what's going on. And then he's like, no, you don't either. Like, it's if God was writing the X-Men right now, this is what it would look like right now. It's amazing. Okay, so this picks up. God, I'm so excited to cover this. This picks up initially the exact same way Powers of X #1 picked up, and this is awesome. I love the way that Hickman does this, because it's one of the things I love the most about Jonathan Hickman, right? Like, everything kind of wraps around. And that's why, like, House of Powers of X is, for the most part, self-contained, but at the same time, it also continues on, especially with the way everything popped off, right? So this starts off, basically, like, back in the day, right? Like, X-Men Years Ago. That's really what Jonathan Hickman calls it. And it picks up with Moira McTaggart basically meeting with Charles Xavier. Now, a lot of what you saw in Powers of X #1 is the exact same, right? Like, House of Powers of X #1 is pretty much the exact same. Insofar as, like, Moira McTaggart sits down, she basically greets Charles Xavier, somebody that she knows. Xavier doesn't know who she is, and then she's just kind of like, well, read my mind and find out what's going on. And so what we do is we jump to the year of X-Men, we jump to year 1000 with the X-Men. Now, this was the point in the story, in Hickman's writing, we had Ascension, right? This idea that somewhere along the line, for what Hickman was kind of showing us, what seemed to be going on, is that you had man and machine, which basically merged, right? The idea of nanosentinels, that initially you had signals created by man, and then signals created Nimrods, and then in turn, they started eventually creating nanobots, right? They could basically attach themselves to humans, and then convert humans into sentinels, which really came out of, like, Bastion, right? When a single Nimrod machine merged with a master. Now, that was back in the 90s, that was long before Hickman showed up, but he kind of took that concept and threw it in there. So it was like, okay, cool, I get what's going on here. And then as a result of that, essentially, like, humanity and robots, whatever it was, they basically achieved a level of ascension. What we're getting here is nothing like what we thought it was. And I was like, dude, this is amazing. Like, this is awesome, because once you have the librarian, right, this guy that we've seen in the previous videos, when the librarian enters into the preserve, right, this kind of like giant makeshift cave, more or less, with animals and other things like that, of course, none of it's real. And he's immediately attacked by one of his inhabitants. And he basically says, like, how many times are you going to do this? Like, you're a primitive beast, right? Like, by the time you realize what you wanted to do, I already prepared countermeasures, right? My mind is far beyond yours. Like, you just relentlessly attacking makes you look like a buffoon. And this is when we find out the person the librarian is talking to is Wolverine. He's been alive for 1,000 years. And it's like, dude, and he hasn't really aged that much. Right now, this is an accurate depiction of Wolverine, right? Like, how we saw Wolverine appear in Old Man Logan, it was probably stress. Technically speaking, Wolverine should not look like he aged that much in the span of 50 years. It's also kind of an interesting thing here, because